Professional baseball is on the wane. Salaries must come down, or the interest of the public must be increased in some way. That quote from Chicago White Stockings owner Albert Spalding sounds like something that might have been said in our time, but he was speaking in 1881. Baseball, as it does, reflects national trends. During the 1980s, income inequality worsened, and social mobility declined in comparison to other developed countries. Today, the United States has a much smaller middle class than it did 50 years ago. That said, owning a sports franchise has never been more profitable, and elite athletes can reap incredible rewards for their talents. As for average Americans, it's a bit more like the minor leagues, where ballplayers dream of reaching the top echelon, even though just 10% will do so. This is John Bodden, Professor of History, and today we're going to talk about the business of Major League Baseball since 1980. Rising player salaries, rising owner revenues, the players' strike of 1994, and Hollywood's relationship to baseball. The construction of new ballparks, the designated hitter rule, and a postseason structure with more opportunities for teams to participate had created a distinctive context for players during the 1980s and 1990s. More importantly, baseball renewed itself with a new generation of exciting stars. And here I will just mention a handful. Nolan Ryan emerged as the best strikeout pitcher of his generation with an overpowering 100-mile-an-hour fastball. He passed Walter Johnson on the all-time career strikeouts list. He threw more no-hitters than any pitcher in the history of the game, meaning no one got a hit during the course of the game. And well into his 40s, this is something I like quite a bit, he was thrilling to watch. He was someone who could throw a no-hitter at that age, and he was a reason to visit the ballpark. Ozzie Smith, nicknamed the Wizard for his brilliant defensive play at shortstop, set major league records for assists and double plays. He won a Gold Glove at the position of shortstop for 13 consecutive seasons. He was a good batter and an excellent base runner, but Smith was someone who was very exciting to watch. He made acrobatic throws from his position. He had incredible range across his playing terrain. Quick reflexes and perfect timing meant he could complete off-balance throws in midair with precision. Occasionally he would perform a backflip. Mike Schmidt was the game's premier power hitter during the 70s and 1980s. He consistently hit 30 or 40 home runs a season, much like Hank Aaron. And Schmidt was a very gifted fielder at third base. He consistently won awards for his defensive abilities. And one thing he did often was walk more than 100 times a season. And he would even strike out. He usually struck out 100 times or more in a season. So Smith got on base a lot from walks. His batting average wasn't especially high, but he didn't ground into many double plays, and he always had an abundance of extra base hits. So he had attributes that modern statisticians understand are so important. Schmidt had a very high on-base percentage and a very high slugging percentage. Rickey Henderson was the greatest leadoff player in Major League Baseball history. He stole more bases than any other player in his lifetime and scored more runs than any other player during his career. He was exciting to watch because when he reached base, there was always the threat of a stolen base, and pitchers knew it, fans knew it, the ballpark knew it. When Rickey would take off, crowds would cheer. In 1982, he stole 130 bases, a major league record, and Henderson was one more reason to visit the ballpark. Briefly, I want to mention two very special ball players that started their careers in the 1980s, Barry Bonds and Ken Griffey Jr. What set these two players apart from their peers, at least during the first two-thirds of their career, was the fact that they could do everything. They could hit for power, run, field, and throw. Not since Willie Mays had Major League Baseball seen such all-around players. They had beautiful swings. They could consistently hit 40 home runs in a season, bat above 300, steal bases, and make exciting throws from the outfield. The World Series played during this era were exciting. In 1986, the Boston Red Sox and the New York Mets played a memorable 7-game series that included high drama, come from behind victories, and to be sure, great heartache for Boston fans. In 1988, the Los Angeles Dodgers faced the Oakland A's in the World Series. And one of the most exciting home runs ever hit by a player named Kirk Gibson, pictured here, um, occurred. Gibson was injured and limping to the plate in the bottom of the ninth inning with 2 outs, a full count, and Gibson won the game with what happens to be one of the most magical memories of my childhood. I watched the game with my entire family in our living room. But apart from this big hit, the 1988 World Series was interesting because the teams played a different kind of baseball with a different philosophy. The Dodgers, to win, the Dodgers relied on the stolen base, stellar pitching, steady defense, and rallies. The Oakland A's were a team that didn't bunt. It had big, powerful sluggers. And this is significant because, again, there were different dimensions to the game. Teams brought different playing philosophies to the contest, and the Dodgers, in this instance, happily won. Well, in 1991, the World Series was played between the AL American League champion Minnesota Twins and the National League champion the Atlanta Braves. And the series went 7 games, with the Twins winning the contest. Well, what makes the series notable is that 5 of its games were decided by a single run. 4 of the games were decided in the final at-bat, and 3 games went into extra innings. So why does any of this matter? Well, it matters for several reasons. First, no franchise was winning the World Series repeatedly. 2, the best teams in baseball were exciting. 3, the World Series had large viewing audiences. Americans were paying attention. And during this era, the average number of fans at any given Major League game was surging. Some of this surge, I think, is attributable to the baby boom generation, this large cohort of men and women who are reaching adulthood in the 80s and 90s. But it can be said that baseball was experiencing something of a golden era. So by any standard, Major League Baseball was competitive and exciting in the 1980s and 1990s. However, the contentious issue of compensation resulted in a big showdown. But before I talk about the players' strike of 1994, I want to back up a bit. The baseball card you see here of Angel Bravo, a Venezuelan outfielder and longtime minor league player, is interesting in that on the back of his playing card it reads, to the right, Angel is an electrician in the off-season. And I show you this because it's unthinkable today to imagine that someone playing at an elite level would have to work in the off-season. But this was commonplace in the 1960s and 70s. Baseball players, professionals, most of them had to work in the off-season. Not the game's stars, but most ball players. They couldn't just rely on their baseball playing income. So the average Major League player had an income about 5 times greater than the average U.S. worker in 1975. And so the average player didn't have to work in the off-season. But the Major League Baseball minimum salary in 1975 was just about double that of the average American worker, or about $70,000 adjusted for inflation in our time. So $70,000, it's not a terrible salary by modern standards, but it's not a salary sufficient to support a lavish lifestyle. And then you have the salaries of most professionals in the minor leagues, and their salaries would be below the poverty line. Minor leaguers had to work during the off-season to support a family. So compensation for baseball players, it increased in the 1980s for those at the major league level. Fan attendance increased too, but salaries were totally stagnant in the minor leagues. And you'll recall that in the 1980s, the reserve clause was finally gone. Okay, so this clause that tied players to teams had been thrown out by the courts, and now there was free agencies. So this gave players new bargaining power, but there was a huge disagreement about how free agency would work, how salary arbitration would work, right? Where you'd have independent figures come in and decide what a fair salary was for a player. And then you also had a big structural change. The United States Congress reduced the marginal tax rate on the highest incomes in the country from 70% to 50% in 1972, and they were lowered further in the 1980s under President Ronald Reagan. So suddenly, high earners, whether business elites or athletic elites, had these new incentives to keep more of what they made. And these changing tax brackets help us to understand why there was such a dramatic growth of income inequality. But back to this issue, the issue of free agency, and how to arbitrate salary disputes, how to figure out what was fair to pay the players. Well, these issues deeply divided players and owners, and I should mention that these conflicts went back to the 1970s. There was a players' strike that occurred in 1972, and at that time the issue was the pension fund. The players, who by now had a union, wanted owners to accept salary arbitration. Now the strike ended on April 13th, and so not very many games were lost in the regular season, but the strikes and lockouts continued. And there was an owners lockout in 1973. The owners locked out the players because they were unhappy about negotiations, about salary arbitration. And then there was another owners lockout in 1976. Owners weren't happy with what was happening. The reserve clause was being undone, and then the players' organization launched a strike in 1980. It occurred during spring training, and players wanted a better collective bargaining agreement. So there were all these issues that weren't resolved. And then the players launched another strike in 1981. And so the players' union, voted unanimously in the middle of the season on May 29th to strike due to unresolved issues surrounding free agent compensation. The owners wanted compensation if they lost a free agent to another team. The players refused. And the strike, it started on June 12th, and it resulted in the cancellation of over 700 games, or about 40% of the season. Terms between the owners and players were reached at the end of July, and play resumed in August. As a result of the strike, players lost $4 million in salary. The owners lost over $70 million in revenue. And you might think that they would have learned a lesson here, but they were still very far apart. Ultimately, the players did agree to restrict free agency to players who had 6 or more years of major league service. The teams that lost premium free agents could get compensatory picks in the draft. They had to sort these kinds of things out. Well, how did fans feel about all this? Well, most fans didn't like it. Attendance dropped in 17 of 24 major league cities, and television ratings for baseball slumped. Well, in 1985, owners, it turned out they were colluding not to offer premium free agents contracts. And this was discovered, and you can imagine that the players were furious, right? That owners were getting together in a smoky room and deciding not to offer the best players higher salaries. So you go in 1990, the owners locked out the players. Once again, the dispute was about free agency and arbitration, salary arbitration. The issue of revenue sharing was involved, and the minimum salary for players, it was raised to $100,000 for the first time. This lockout scuttled spring training and pushed back opening day week, but the regular season was played, but none of the real issues were resolved. Well, that takes us to 1994. Owners wanted a salary cap and revenue sharing. They claimed small market teams would not be able to compete without such a mechanism. And the players' union vigorously opposed any salary cap. They remembered the owners' collusion in 1985. There was lingering mistrust. And so the 1994 season started and unfolded over many months. And then the players' union voted to go on strike in August towards the end of the season. And then the season, to everyone's surprise, ended. And it did not restart. This was unsettling to many people. For the first time in American sports history, an entire postseason was canceled. No World Series happened for the first time in nearly 90 years. Members of Congress introduced 5 different bills that aimed to end the baseball strike. Owners talked about using replacement players from the minor leagues. And some managers said they wouldn't manage replacement players. So the two sides really dug in and hoped to win a public relations battle. Well, the players basically said, look, we're the ones who play. We put the product on the field. Attendance is up. It's way up, in fact, and it's because of what we do that revenues are up, not because of what the owners do. And the owners are reaping these fabulous profits, and we just want our fair share. So the dispute continued through the winter and grew distasteful. For average Americans, it felt like millionaires squabbling with another group of super millionaires. Why can't they just reach an agreement and get back to work? Well, the two sides did eventually make peace in April 1995, and baseball games resumed nearly 1 month after the regular season typically starts. Well, how did the '94 strike affect fans? Well, a lot of baseball fans were furious. Well, they were angry. They felt disappointed, disillusioned. 25% fewer fans went to games in 1995. On opening day, there were boos and jeers. And the fact that the World Series had been canceled in 1994 meant that there were some fans who didn't want to watch baseball anymore. I mentioned there was lowered attendance in the mid 1990s after this long period of steadily rising attendance levels. Players, for their part, they lost 230 million in salary because of the games not played. The owners lost 580 million in revenues. The Montreal Expos, who had a commanding lead in the National League East in 1994, would never get to know how the season would end and if they would get a chance to reach the World Series for the first time. I think the strike taught the players and owners a lesson about the consequences of such standoffs, and it was the last major work stoppage in Major League Baseball since the strike ended in 1995. Well, the profitability of baseball was not affected in the long term by the strike. Owners have never made so much money thanks to deals with cable providers and online streaming services. So the owners have been able to capture the lion's share of profits from their teams. And since the strike, average player salaries have gone up to levels unthinkable 50 years ago, with average players making more than $4 million on average per year, and elite players earning upwards of $30 million per year. So the pie has gotten, the Major League Baseball pie, the business of baseball has gotten much bigger. And players have received some of that increased pie, but most of the profits remain with the owners. Now, what about the relationship of fans to players? Well, it's different now. Players leave cities and fan bases for more money, and that disappoints fans. Fans get annoyed when someone who's paid millions of dollars doesn't hustle to first base, or gets hurt, or plays poorly. At the minimum, the rising incomes have created a disconnect, a social distance between players and fans. And I want to say two more things. First, there was a boom of excellent baseball movies in the 1980s. You should watch them all. They're all incredibly good. And I think it begs the question, why did Hollywood produce so many great baseball movies during this decade? And I reckon it has something to do with the nostalgia that people felt, especially baby boomers might have felt for an era, a previous era perceived as more innocent, less tainted by strikes and lockouts or acrimonious struggles over money, and in these contract negotiations that are ongoing these days. Second, the all-time leader in hits, Pete Rose, was banned from baseball in 1989 for betting on games in which he managed and played in. And Rose was placed on baseball's list of ineligible players for the Hall of Fame, and he cannot be elected to the Hall of Fame despite his playing accomplishments. And as with all things baseball, this is a topic with where Americans have different opinions. Some believe that Rose's playing accomplishments alone warrant election to the Hall of Fame. Others see his transgressions as warranting a punishment that will deter all future players who might consider betting on baseball. Well, what do you think? Is Pete Rose like Shoeless Joe Jackson, or are the two men too different for a meaningful comparison? Do you think Major League Baseball should consider clemency in the cases of Jackson or Rose? Has the rise in player compensation since the 1980s changed your view of professional athletes? I'll leave you with these questions. Until next time.